It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza.
Hello, Irwin.
So a few weeks ago, I took a walk with our guest today, Margie Ruddick from One Landscape, and we took a nice walk in Lazy Point, right near her home in Amagansett, right near my home in Springs. And we got to talking, and she's like-minded, Esperanza.
We like that.
we do like like-minded. So without any further ado, I'd like to bring in our special guest from the One Landscape, Margie Ruddick. Hi, Margie.
Hi, how are you? Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome.
We're excited to have you, Margie. Actually, because you do sort of fit right into what the mission is of Our Hamptons, which is, as you know, Margie's a fan as well, Esperanza, in case you didn't know. She is.
We're building our fan base. Okay.
We are.
Yay.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you, though.
Well, we do appreciate that. But Margie, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing? We'll start with your background first. I know your background is really as a landscape architect, and I have to tell you, Esperanza, if for no other reason, Margie and I feel an immediate connection because one of her major projects was at Queens Plaza.
Oh, yes, I know, and of course that pulls at your heartstrings.
I'm a queen. I'm Queens through and through, Margie. I can't help myself. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, how did this work sort of lead into where we're going to go with One Landscape?
Well, so I went to graduate school at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard in the 80s. And at that point, there were kind of two camps in landscape architecture. One was the sort of eco GIS, very much ecologically oriented, and the other was, quote, design. And the two were really not talking to each other. But I had actually started out working in Central Park on the restoration and then for the Natural Resources Group. And I grew up spending every summer and weekend, aside from the winter when our house is closed up, out here in Amagansett. And the landscape, the wild landscapes of Napeague and, Beach Hampton were really in my blood. I think of them as my native landscape. And so I really wanted to bring those two together. And it took about 20 years for the whole field to really progress. So by the time Queens Plaza was finished in 2012, it really was about nature in the city. And it was about a kind of a wild landscape in a very urban environment. And I wasn't the only person doing that kind of work. It was the field had kind of sort of progressed apace. But I had been so I always had a kind of an odd practice because I stayed small and I worked on odd projects like this project in India, which was a 3,500 acre reserve.
You're talking about the Shillim retreat, I guess.
Yes.
Okay.
And in that process of like 20 years of working on that, I really felt like I had to unlearn a lot of the professionalized kind of methods that we used in landscape architecture and planning. And I really appreciate your mission because I really became much more aware of how building a kind of a team incrementally and organically within the community can be much more effective, much more sustainable than kind of flying in, flying out as a professional doing your thing. So
grassroots, no pun intended, or pun intended.
And what I found was that there were a lot of people locally who had been really moving in the same direction that we were, and that just getting to know them and bringing them together was actually way more effective than coming in with outside consultants and analysts. And so over the next, 10 years or so, after we founded the Shillim Institute, which was this institute within the reserve to really bring sort of the issues of sustainable development into a kind of a working environment with workshops and bringing artists and scientists together, I started to think of what to do locally in my backyard where I live. And so we started One Landscape to really be where I am. And, I live in Sleepy Hollow, a little north of New York City. But I'm, also out here. I'm in Amagansett right now. And so I started to think about, I think it's a little bit of my pushback to my field to say, there are ways of doing this kind of conservation work that aren't necessarily going to, using all of the work of all the scientists and horticulturists and policymakers who have been working on these projects, but actually making their work visible. Because a lot of times it sort of stays in the realm of science and, documents. So you have to read through all these reports and you look at these maps that are basically symbols. So we just wanted to make this kind of landscape visible. So that's what we're doing in Amagansett, Napeague, and the Springs, is actually doing these drawings and mappings that show you what an incredible array of wild landscapes are there. And the response I've been getting has been incredible. Just people they know these places, but they don't know that they're all connected.
Right.
And so that's kind of the background of how I got here.
Understood. And I think your geographical choice, particularly in Napeague, and this is something Esperanza and I have, amongst each other, have said this over the years. We affectionately refer to Napeague and, by extension, Lazy Point, like nowhere else.
Yes.
And it really is true. I mean, it's certainly not on Eastern Long Island. So I want to get a little bit more into this because now that is where the wild landscape is. And obviously that is certainly wild, although there are issues, currently with the southern pine beetles that are going to start changing that landscape. I've read that a lot of the landscape there is being eradicated by these southern pine beetles. But getting onto this, I just want to digress for 1 second.
Sure.
We understand the wild, and let me be clear, Esperanza and I love wild landscape. We don't like. If you want to talk about something that sticks in our craw, Margie, when I go to a beach Hampton or I go to a dunescape and I see sod or up island ornamentals, I get crazy.
Right.
Yeah.
Hold me back. You don't want to be in the same room as me. But on this mission, now we're going to get back to the wild part, but are you working with the community in terms of the mindset of, hey, maybe sod isn't the best choice in a dunescape? Is that part of what One Landscape is doing?
Well, so this particular project is a pilot project that we're using to just hone our skills in mapping and in dealing with the community issues that come up. So there's actually no real client here. We're just doing this as a study that's then going to help us to lay out all of our methods and schedules and practices for conservation workshops in places. We're doing one at Shillim in India. We were thinking about doing something with the Shinnecock, a couple of the Shinnecock elders, Roddy Smith, and a couple others, but we didn't want to just go into those workshops without having really standardized a lot of our methods. So these mapping exercises have been really, really useful. And then also just things come up like it's a perfect case study. So the fact that there are so many small parcels that the Community Preservation Fund actually has set aside for protection. But I've talked to Jim Grimes, who's a trustee, about how do you actually maintain them? How do you see them as one landscape and not as little pockets of properties? So we're as a nonprofit and a 501c3, we're kind of enjoined from advocating. So I'm just hoping that some of the work that we're doing will just be useful and helpful to people who do want to sort of tighten up some of the guidelines for landscape out here, because East Hampton has a really, really good planning and conservation infrastructure. and they already have great conservation, you know, initiatives, but people don't necessarily pay attention to them.
They're not
So,
aware of them, don't you think? I mean, does it become something like those things exist, but people just aren't aware
well,
of them?
people are aware because you have to usually get a permit to do the work. So quite often people will do the permitting drawings that show that 50% is going to remain untouched, and, you know, like using native plants, but they're not necessarily going to follow through with those. And that's really a reality. So I think people are aware, but they also maybe don't understand why it's important. It just seems like, you know, okay, you have to follow these rules. But if you actually start to see your property as part of a much bigger landscape, then you can understand why it's so important to follow these guidelines.
Right, but if people like, I'm thinking of one recent example that came came to my attention with people who go in, clear their land, and then they're told they have to revegetate, and they're told what to plant, and it's all natives and things like that. But then the deer come in, and then they're like, oh, we spent all this money, and now all the
Right.
deer are eating all our plants. And
Right.
you know, it's this sort of circular argument, and you're thinking, okay, there's something wrong here, because clearly you shouldn't have emptied your property
Right.
of what was there.
Right.
And I think that's where I'm saying that people are not aware. You know,
Yes.
you're maybe speaking of a landscape company that's going to go in
Right.
and help somebody, but the regular homeowner does not
Yeah.
really have that knowledge
Yeah.
and the facility to, or the interest necessarily. They just come in
Right.
and they want to lay down the sod. You know, they're just more
Right.
interested in having that landscape. It's a very suburban kind of approach to the landscape, which is unsensitive to the
Yeah.
area.
Yeah, but I've been finding in my own practice that more people in the quote Hamptons, you call Napeague, you know, sort of like nowhere else, but we call everywhere from east of the IGA, which is where the terminal moraine ends, you know, the glacier ended, and
Yes.
it's low. We call it the Beyond Hampton. So
I like
like
that.
I'm finding that more and more people are calling us up to say, you know, we don't want that suburban look. We do, I think it's a market thing. I think it's what people offer. And so
Yeah.
a lot of people would want to do what's, you know, appropriate, but they're maybe not being connected with the right landscapers. There are a lot of landscapers out here who do great work. You know, I mentioned Jim Grimes. We work with Summerhill. We work with Martyrs, and they're doing very sensitive work on our projects. But the thing is that I feel as if the other thing for them to understand is that there are a lot of plants. When you actually do remove a lot of vegetation, it's I think you implied this, that it's not the same just to go replace it with quote native plants. There's in our area, there's one plant in particular, Hudsonia, that if you remove it, it can't be propagated. I mean, people have been trying to propagate it for years and years, and that's gone. So that very singular dune landscape will disappear. So
go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Margie.
No, you go ahead, because I was just going to say that I feel like it's very much an educational process, a process of educating people about why they love it here so much.
That's agreed. Yeah,
Margie's
that's our point.
Hey, Esperanza.
She's the segue queen.
She's now a segue.
She's the segue princess.
I'm sitting here. I have to say, I'm sitting here writing these little notes to myself as this is going on, because I wanted to just first of all apologize to Margie. I wasn't implying in terms of a client when I said this about working on your wild landscape.
Oh, yeah, right.
It was more to the point, and it's a word Esperanza and I use an awful lot on our Hamptons, and it's mindset. Yes. I love the term you have of One Landscape. The name of this organization is One Landscape. And if we break this name down, One Landscape, let's stop thinking of my half acre, your 2/3 of an acre. Right. We're one landscape. Right. I love that. And it certainly resonates with me deeply. I'm even going to go out on a limb and say I think it resonates with Esperanza.
Okay.
What do you say? going out on a limb.
Yeah, that's a very long limb.
It's not really that long.
Not at all.
It's not really that long. But we definitely feel that way. And so I guess what I'm trying to bring across is it's the mindset. And this is, again, something we talk about a lot here, the mindset towards supersizing of houses, the mindset of towards clearing land, the mindset of sod instead of pollinators.
Right.
That's where I'd like to go with this. I mean, because I'm the way I'm reading into this, and after reading about your website, the very definition of a wild landscape, isn't it more or less exactly that, Margie?
Yeah, I mean it's many things. But I think that the bottom line is that it's a landscape that's self-perpetuating, that actually operates on many levels to cultivate life, that is a living landscape. And you know what happens with sod and with the sort of ornamental plantings is that the amount of habitat that is possible in those landscapes is bit minimal compared with, you know, doing more native plantings and providing cover. So for instance, we have wild turkeys here in Beachhampton. Just over the last several years, we're seeing more and more of them, and also grouse and all sorts of creatures that really rely on cover. So they rely on that lower stratum of grasses and woody vines and things. And when you rip all of that out, they don't have anywhere to go. So it's very much about promoting life.
Yeah, which is what happened with the quail. I think the bob whites that used to have here all the time, and they don't have that that habitat any longer.
Right. And one of, you know, Beachhampton to me is such an amazing case study also because it was a grid that was laid out in the 20s, but it's dirt roads with tangles of front landscape that, you know, I always harken back to the $800,000 threshold. When the houses started to get way more expensive in Beachhampton, and all of a sudden you saw little houses for $800,000, all of a sudden people started to do landscapes that bringing in the Belgian block, bringing in the sod, bringing in split roof, the sort of Bridgehampton, not Bridgehampton has a lot of wild landscapes, but you know, that kind of hedge and lawn look.
Yeah.
And I think people
very
felt
maintained.
embarrassed.
Yeah.
I think people were kind of embarrassed saying my place looks like a mess, but it wasn't a mess. It actually was habitat. And I think the fact that the roads are so narrow and that they're dirt roads, a lot of people are now, for instance, my neighbor, it's a new house by Bates Massey that's beautiful, and they've restored the dune. So a lot of people are really enjoying doing restoration work and living in it. And they really feel very lucky to be able to live in this kind of incredible beachgrass landscape.
Yeah.
That's a great point. I mean, it really is the demographic in a sense and the economics that are driving this kind of landscaping. I mean, it's
what's changing that sense of the area of what it was originally, you know, to an extent. I'm not saying, you know, with the subdivision that it was clearly something else before, much wilder, but the development of it was more sensitive prior to what you're saying, this change with driveway aprons and so forth. So yeah,
exactly.
But, you know, I think that nature wins out a lot. And what happened when I was about 10 was that we used to play in the dunes to the west of us. Beachhampton ended at Surf Drive. And then sometime when I was around 10, the surveying sticks came out and they started to survey all of the windy roads of Dune Road and Deerfield. And it was shocking. And these little contemporary houses started popping up, and we thought, there goes the landscape. But now, you know, 50 years later, nature has kind of won out in that whole area, and that you have a lot of dune that just restored itself. You have a lot of people who actually planted native plants and grasses and trees. I mean, there are a lot of invasive trees as well, like Russian olive, but you know, people are slowly starting to remove them and replace them with things that are native. So I feel like if you look in more glacial time, that nature kind of, it's terrible to think that for the next 20 years or so, we're going to have lawns, but eventually nature will kind of win out if it's allowed to, which it was.
And with our help a little bit, right? I mean, this has definitely been the summer of anti-lawn. If I've read 20 articles on,
yes.
on how unsustainable lawns are, it's too many. But I was curious to know about, no, I'm sorry, go ahead, Irwin.
No, go. Not, I'm hanging on your every word, not at all.
No, I was curious when you're talking about that change. I mean, I remember, and this is something I was curious to know, how like in the 1938 hurricane completely changed the landscape, and I feel like that was a moment when, I mean, I recall growing up, the stretchy stretch was much more barren. I mean, not just without houses, without the structures on it, but the fact was there weren't all these tall trees. I remember it being much lower. So I find that evolution interesting.
Yeah.
And that could very well happen again. So to your point of nature kind of takes over, as much as we want to fight it, it kind of comes back and rears its head.
Yes, and what's happened because of all the building. So my house, about 400 square feet of my house, was actually the real estate office for Beach Hampton, and it was one of the only structures that was left after the 38 hurricane. So then it was built onto in the 40s, and when my parents bought it in 1957, it was basically a little white asbestos shingle shack on sand. There's nothing. It was sand and some pine trees. And so because people are building houses and there's more shelter, much more is able actually to grow than if it were just open dune.
Yes.
So in fact, one of the things about one landscape that is a really important principle is that we really focus on understanding human interaction in the landscape. But it's not just about there's wild nature out there and people are always doing very destructive things, but in fact, there is an interactive process, feedback loop, where humans do things. If you look at how the Shinnecock actually managed the woodlands until the last generation, Roddy Smith talks about how I think his father did burns, or his grandfather did burns of the forest on the Shinnecock Reservation, and that there always was this interaction where humans were doing things that actually promoted habitat. So it's not just that we're very destructive, although we are.
Yes. When you say you're doing things, getting back to the actual project you're working on from Amagansett to Napeague, sound mapping and aerial imagery. Esperanza and I are always fearful sometimes of going too deep into the weeds, but I think it's important for us to get some kind of grasp on basically what does that mean. So you're doing aerial imagery and sound mapping, and what's the end game towards this? To just come up with a synopsis of what specifically?
So I think that we have a whole array of products or whatever. One is the maps. Another is the work that artists and scientists are doing together to do sort of habitat studies. And that we haven't started yet, but that's Vicky Colombe, a painter, is going to be going out to just do drawings of the different habitats in Napeague, for instance. Tanya Marcuse, a photographer who photographs the ground plane. She has these amazing photographs of the ground, and she's just going to be doing photographs of the ground. Sutton Lynch, who is actually a local, recent college graduate, is doing really beautiful video studies of different parts of this landscape. So not only are we doing these maps that you can look at and say, oh, I understand this is Napeague, we're also doing things that kind of immerse you in the landscape so that you can really, I think artists are very often way ahead of the curve in terms of helping people really connect with the landscape and understand it on a visceral level. And so, but scientists also quite often are operating on the same wavelength, but their methods are a little more dry. So putting them together, you often get something that is really science-based, but is also really evocative. And I think that's the whole purpose, is to have people really understand the power of these landscapes in a very personal way and sort of intimate way.
Mhm.
So that's sort of the array. And then we also have a sort of performance kind of a structure that an architect who's an acoustical architect has been designing to allow people to have performances that you don't need amplification for. So it's using the recycling blades from wind turbines to create a backdrop that actually will reflect sound, so that you could have something out at Napeague State Park. You could have something, say, the Palmanok Path. We're talking about doing a kind of a revival of the Palmanok Path, looking at what it actually was, if it was one path or was it a network of paths, and working with the archives that the Shinnecock Nation have that really do say exactly where these routes were. So in addition, not in addition to that, but those are the kind of individual pieces, but the overarching structure are these maps that we're making, taking the aerial photographs and then drawing over them. Because when you look at the area, like from Google Earth, you just see gray. You can't really distinguish between a wetland, a
Right.
woodland.
Right, the true topography or the
Yes. So we're doing
landscape.
a series of maps that actually show you that. And they're, I've been actually doing them on my laptop, that, you're drawing over the aerial to pull out like the walking dunes. When you actually look at the aerial, you can actually determine it's 3 parabolic dunes, but you wouldn't know it if you're a layperson. So how do you actually draw that so people can say, oh my goodness, there's this incredible series of dunes that I want to go visit?
Mhm.
Right.
And,
This is now I have to ask this question, because this is and it really got to almost my first thought about this, about wild landscape in relation to unwild landscape, if you will. So I understand the concept of doing this in an environment like Napeague. It's certainly so suitable. Can you do the same kind of project, Margie, over a developed community? Can you do this over the heart of Springs, an area that has high
absolutely.
density,
Yeah.
certainly the highest density in the town of East Hampton? Is it appropriate? Is it worthwhile to do something like that?
100%. And in the maps that we've done, we actually are looking at the forest from Amagansett, from the Deborah Ann Light Preserve, all the way to Acaponic Harbor, and they're really varied. And how do you actually understand them? And there are large areas that are protected there, and that's part of the town of East Hampton's. What they've done that's really amazing is to understand. There are there's Stony Hill, and there's the whole beach preserve. So there are these sort of identifiable pieces within it, but actually when you look at it as a whole, including people's properties,
That's what I'm
there
going
is
Yeah.
for.
so much that's intact there, and it's really remarkable. So that when you drive through, from up Cranberry Hill Road, and you go right down to the Devon Yacht Club, you actually see the different microclimates where all of a sudden the trees get very tall, and all of a sudden you have a mix of beaches. And so if you actually understand that these are really diverse forests, and a lot of people have them in their backyards, so really understanding how you are part of this as a homeowner, I think, is really important.
I almost think the one landscape mission, it's even, here's a word, it sounds even cooler if you do it over an area with a lot of density like that, just to see,
Yeah.
especially in an area out here that has a higher density. Yes, we're going to use Springs as an example only because it's the highest density, but yes, we have a lot of small half-acre lots, etc., and so on, but there is open space juxtaposed with that. So to see sort of an overview of that, it's
Right.
just fascinating.
Well, so what is going to come out of this is a kind of a book, and that will contain not only the drawings that show all the colors and the textures, but also we did one drawing that's a negative. So you're actually just looking at the houses, and it's incredible to see the density. And when you're just looking at the maps, you think it looks like forest, it looks like oak, mixed forest. And then when you look at the negative, you realize that there are houses chock-a-block throughout that. And it's incredible that the forest has prevailed.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's true because I've always loved it's like a sense of reassurance that I've had if I've ever flown over the area, which has happened a couple of times,
Yeah,
where I kind of feel, it doesn't feel so developed as I think it
Right.
is
yes,
from the street level, which
right,
you feel like there's a canopy, there are so many more, there's so
right,
much more growth than you think, in the sense of vegetation.
right. Well,
Yeah.
and just to get back to um, people living with the landscape and in the landscape, there's a tradition until very recently, not just a Native American tradition, but a Bonic practice, but a Boniker practice. The fishermen and farmers and the Shinnecock and Manchaca were all very amicable because they really were more subsistence level living where they didn't have to get more and more and more and more, and they're living off the land.
Right.
So I think
Right.
that we have a really strong tradition here of people getting by with very little and really having a very, very rich life in the landscape, in nature.
Yeah, and I would say you say getting by with very little. I would say getting by with what they needed. What they're
No, that's right.
the bounty of this land is incredible, right? So
Yes,
there
right.
really
And
was no more
Amenities?
need. Yeah, those the different kinds of amenities.
well, when I say very little, I think it's square. I'm thinking square footage. I'm just
Yeah,
thinking
yeah,
houses and getting by with, there's I don't want to like call out too many people, but in a good way. But um there are a number of people who are fishermen and women who still are selling fish, basically from their houses.
hmm
And, when you go there, it's just a very different landscape. It doesn't have a lot of fences,
correct.
and it's not about staking your claim with your house and cordoning it off. It really is
Correct.
about living in a larger landscape. So I
We,
think,
yeah.
go ahead.
We're all about that.
We
And that's what I
completely.
grew up with. And I totally understand that. And that connection to the land. I mean, we've talked about, the Baymen and that existed far more even when I was growing up here than it seems to now. But we
I,
just
Yep.
have such an influx of people not from here
right.
that have
But
not identified with the
but
landscape yet.
as a restorer of faith, Margie and Esperanza, I have to say, I still buy my fish from a miller,
Oh,
and
you too.
it's
That's exactly what I was talking about.
yeah, it is a really good feeling. We really need to start wrapping this up, but
Okay.
this is just I, I I'll be honest, I'm just fascinated by this mission. I love the name because really we're all in this together. We truly indeed are one landscape.
Mhm.
And we really have to think in terms of that. Margie's website is onelandscape.org. And we encourage all the listeners of our Hamptons to go there, look into this a little bit. And it's just fascinating stuff. It's where we need to head and where we need to go. Um, I'm all in, Margie.
Oh,
Yes.
that's
Yes.
so great. Well, I also wanted to mention though that my landscape practice is margieruddick.com.
Okay.
Yes.
Uh, if people are interested, you did ask something about how we engage with community, but we're always looking for people who want to do mapping with us for one landscape, and then people who want to intern with us in the landscape practice. So both of those, onelandscape.org and margieruddick.com, have information, and you can just go info at either one of them, and I'll probably get it.
And that's fantastic. And they can, so, okay, that's great. I appreciate you telling us that. So, yes, reach out at either margieruddick.com or onelandscape.org for all of that. Margie Ruddick, we really
Yes.
appreciate you taking the time and
Thank
visiting with
you.
us this afternoon.
Thank you. Well, I have to say, I completely appreciate your mission, and I have really loved listening to the podcast so far, and I'm looking forward to the next ones.
Oh my gosh. Excuse me, Esperanza, can you please come over right now? I don't think I could get my head through the door. Thank you so much, Margie.
Thank you,
Thank you so much.
Margie.
Okay,
Okay.
thanks. We'll
Bye-bye.
talk soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.